Welcome back to the Public Rail Now podcast. This is Adam, of course, your host, and we're very happy to have Nick Wurst, the General Secretary of Railroad Workers United, back on the program to talk about the Union Pacific merger with Norfolk Southern, what that means for railroad workers, the environment, trackside communities, and the rail system. To learn more about how you can get involved in Railroad Workers United's campaign against the merger, please visit railroadworkersunited.org. And for more information about Public Rail Now, please visit publicrailnow.org. Thanks for listening. Okay, we're rolling. Nick, it's great to have you back. I think something that is on everybody's minds right now, anybody who's paying attention to the railroads at least, is this merger between Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern. And can you give our listeners a little bit of a background? How long has this discussion been happening? What's some of the background behind this attempt to buy out Norfolk Southern?
Yeah, so I think the important thing to first off remind everybody about, especially people who are just coming to this without sort of a background of following the industry and the railroads, is that in the U.S. and in North America, especially the U.S. and Canada, where there's a lot of overlap between some of these carriers, there's really just a handful of big railroad companies that own the majority of track in the United States, that run the majority of trains in the United States, and they're all sort of freight companies, basically. So Union Pacific and BNSF are kind of the two big boys in sort of like the western half of the country, and then CSX and Norfolk Southern are the two big ones on the eastern half of the country. And then there's some other Class 1 railroads, including CPKC, which was merged just a couple of years ago when Canadian Pacific bought Kansas City Southern. And that's an interesting thing to talk about in the context of these mergers and how the sort of the scale of what we're talking about is very different. But obviously it's a big deal because we're already in a situation where there's just a handful of companies basically control the entirety of the freight rail industry in the United States, which is the best, safest, most efficient way to move big amounts of goods, and especially materials that you don't want trucked, over the interstate system. And so, a merger between Union Pacific on the West Coast and Norfolk Southern on the East Coast, and it's not even the coast, right? Union Pacific in the western half of the country and Norfolk Southern in the eastern half of the country would be the first of its kind, where we would have one massive transcontinental railroad that really you're approaching sort of monopoly scale here. So I think that's obviously a big, scary thing to consider, especially when you sort of start to factor in the state of the industry, where things are, the sort of the headlines that everybody's been seeing over the last, few years. But I think the real sort of thing driving this is the railroads have, over the last few decades, been in this drive to constantly get to sort of like the perfect operating ratio, right? What they call it. Basically, they've been in this massive drive to decrease expenses, increase revenues, make more money while spending less money. And that's also coming in the form of, sort of shedding less profitable service, less, sort of high volume service. And so the idea of merging or buying another railroad in the other half of the country, I think sort of it's tied up in, this is sort of like the next logical step of, okay, if you've basically cut as much as you can, and you've tried to boost your revenue, as much as possible, uh, sort of with just your system, then the next step is starting to look elsewhere and say, okay, can we buy up something else and sort of cannibalize it and chop bits off of it and try to boost that, boost our revenue or profits even more. I think this is sort of being driven by this, drive to see if they can keep generating more and more profit, and keep making the shareholders happier and happier. Um, because I think there's been, aside from the sort of big drama, with like the almost strike of a few years ago, and then the derailments in 2023, and everything like that. I think sort of more behind the scenes, there's been, sort of a long, or not, I don't know if I want to say long, but a generalized sort of decline in, traffic, in the number of carloads moved, and that's having an impact on the shareholders. I think there's been, sort of aside from the really dramatic stuff, there's been behind the scenes and in industry, journals and publications and things like that, we've been seeing, I guess, less confidence, from sort of the shareholders and the big money investors that come to the railroads to try to make money, in sort of the railroads being able to do that in their current form, which I think is really, yeah, like I said, driving this whole thing.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, thinking about the railroad system, there's this massive contradiction that the industry is strangling itself. It's shifting more and more freight onto trucks, not doing any sort of maintenance work, no expansion for capacity, things like that. It's still wildly profitable, but I always was thinking about how long would it take for, the sort of the party to end. Like when would they start to realize, like, okay, well, these short-term profits that we've been pursuing through, like you said, like there's this whole, cult of the operating ratio where they just like cut and cut and cut, like down to the bone. And I wanted to bring up, like, this has been a trend, at least from what I can tell, since at least the 1980s, with the Staggers Act that deregulated the railroads. There was like 40, give or take, class 1 railroads. Now we're down to 6, soon to be 5, then, fewer and fewer. But in terms of, I guess, like that trajectory, how, they've adopted this sort of like austerity position for the rail industry, cut, and squeeze out as much profit as possible for the shareholders. Like, what impact has that had on service workloads, and this tendency towards, I guess, monopolization? They already operated like a cartel for a long time, but now it sort of seems like they're just consolidating. So, what does that look like, and what do you foresee happening as these class 1 railroads start devouring each other?
Yeah, I mean, and I think the, when does the party end, question is an incredibly important one, because that's what's driving this, right? Is they want to keep the party going. I mean, if we look at any sort of like economic crisis that's happened, like in our lifetimes, bubbles burst. That's what they do, right? And eventually you cut too deep, or you go too big, or and it all comes crashing down in a really catastrophic way. And I think it's sort of ironic, because the idea of buying another big railroad to try to basically keep the party going, is, I think, what is, might, I guess I don't want to try to be, Nostradamus too much here, but I think that's the kind of move that actually could push the party over the edge, right? And really sort of bring it all, crashing down. So I don't know. I think it's kind of ironic, right? It's the same thing that's driving this move, but at the same time, this move might you know, do exactly what they're trying to avoid. And that's related to sort of like the history in the industry and the trends in the industry. I mean, this has happened before. The party has ended before. In the Northeast in the 60s and I guess 70s, the the railroads in the Northeast ran themselves into the ground, and there were a whole bunch of actually really disastrous mergers. Uh, and the industry in the Northeast sort of ran itself into the ground to the point where it collapsed, and the federal government had to sort of step in as the ultimate sort of guarantor, I guess is the word of service, both freight and passenger service, and that's where you get Conrail from, is from all these railroads in the Northeast running themselves into the ground, after all these disastrous mergers and all these attempts to sort of, get greedy. So I think like when we're talking about that, it's like in some ways the scale of this is on another level, right? The idea of Union Pacific buying Norfolk Southern is on a very different scale from like sort of like the Penn Central merger and something like that, which was sort of regional. I guess it was a big deal back then, but since then we have, like you were saying, way less class ones, sort of the big dogs. There's a smaller number of big dogs, and the big dogs have gotten even bigger, right? These are already railroads on a size and scale that's sort of unprecedented in our history. And so the idea of getting even bigger is huge. And I think, you mentioned the Staggers Act and sort of the consolidation since, the 80s, and especially in the last sort of 20, 30 years of railroads buying up other railroads, both in the sense of sort of the big class ones also, buying up other class ones, but also things like, the rise of Genesee and Wyoming as sort of an umbrella company that buys up smaller railroads and merges them all, and doesn't really merge them in the sense of turning them all into one entity, but then when they do buy up all these smaller class 2 and class 3 railroads, they go and they say, okay, now we've got a few class 2s in the same general area, so we can get rid of a bunch of dispatchers and combine, it's all going to get dispatched centrally, or we can get rid of some of these mechanical craft guys, and they can take they can get supported from these other Genesee and Wyoming properties that we have in the area, and this, that, and the other. So all of that, the impact of all of this, sort of the consolidation of the class ones, the consolidation of these smaller railroads, and then the cost cutting, right? The quote unquote precision scheduled railroading measures that sort of follow and go hand in hand. It's driven basically every metric in the industry down. I mean, I have to always plug the economic impact study that was produced by Public Rail Now, by Railroad Workers United, of looking at, you have to start with where the industry is now. And so there's just like some numbers that are always worth reminding everybody about. Since 2000, the number of railroad employees has fallen by 25%, and volume of carloads has fallen off by over 30%. We've lost a huge chunk of the agricultural industry, in terms of the shipping agricultural freight to trucking. And that's the industry, agriculture has been actually growing. Just all of that growth has gone to trucks instead of rails. The networks shed, the class 1 network has shed about 30,000 miles of track. So it's getting worse, right? The railroads are moving less stuff. They're moving less freight, which, in theory is the whole point, right? That's what the railroads exist to do, is to move stuff, and they're actually getting worse. And so since that's the long-term trends, is there's consolidation, less and less railroads, bigger and bigger railroads. Meanwhile, basically every performance metric gets worse and worse. So I don't think it's crazy to say that there's a connection there, right?
Yeah, and something I wanted to ask you about, actually, I had read something recently, and it kind of surprised me. Just speaking of, all this the freight being taken off the rails and put on the trucks, is that if I'm not mistaken, the American Trucking Association came out against the merger or the buyout, and that kind of was a little bit surprising to me, because the way that I was thinking of it is this would just continue the the long trajectory of the railroad industries, of just like only picking and choosing the most profitable shippers, for example, and only serving them. And so I thought, wow, that's kind of weird that this trucking industry group would come out against the merger, when, from my understanding, this merger would just continue doing that, continue taking freight off the railroads and onto trucks. Like, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not an expert in the trucking industry, so I think some of this might be speculation, but it's not just the rail industry that's been sort of in a long term crisis in like the last 10 years. I mean, um, a couple of years ago, there was coming out of sort of like the after effects of the cuts that the railroads had carried out during COVID and during all of the various PSR implementation and everything like that. There was a massive shortage of railroad workers, especially train crews, and it got so bad that the federal government was basically dragging the various CEOs in front of um, committee hearings to testify about why there were trains just parked for days because they didn't have enough crews to move them. Um, and that headline was sort of like very shocking. But I think when we're talking about trucking, those kinds of headlines have been in the news forever. I mean, talk about sort of deregulation. The trucking industry got deregulated hard. I mean, it hit the Teamsters union incredibly hard, um, in terms of their organizing long haul trucking and things like that. And so the trucking industry has been in a crisis for a while now too, from sort of my limited knowledge. I mean, I'm used to seeing headlines about shortage of truckers, sort of the really shitty quality of life associated with sort of long haul trucking, and uh, the challenges of being like an owner operator or contracting to like a bigger trucking company. And so I think it's interesting because there's sort of like this uh, if the railroads are in crisis and the railroads are driving off um, freight customers and they're not able to meet the demand, but then the trucking industry is also sort of struggling to absorb uh, any kind of new growth or any of that business that gets thrown off from the railroads, then where does it go? I mean, the stuff's got to move. Um, and so I think there's maybe an assumption that people make, that the trucking industry has sort of like infinite capacity, both in the sense of having people and equipment to move stuff, but also things like the degradation of like the interstate system and the really crappy quality of like local roads and things like that. That's all that has an impact, right? So if there's going to be more stuff is going to get trucked, there's a capacity question in that industry too. It's not just the railroad. So I think it's an interesting thing to consider. Of course, there also is sort of I guess that would be one reason why sort of the heads of trucking companies might be nervous about this. But I think there's also the possibility that maybe they aren't as skeptical about the logic of the merger. The heads of Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern have been going around and saying this is gonna help us expand. We're gonna move more freight. We're gonna be able to better service customers. We're gonna be able to pass on the savings to the customers. We're gonna be able to lower rates. We're actually, some of them have gone around and said, oh, we're actually gonna create jobs and things like that. So maybe it's possible that some of the trucking industry buys that and thinks that a consolidated UPNS would actually be much more of a competitive threat. But I think either way, it's interesting because, like you're saying, it's sort of the knock-on effects of the railroad touches all of these other different industries. And so when there's this discussion of a merger on this scale, everybody basically has a reason to get nervous about it.
Definitely, yeah. I want to get your thoughts on shippers here in a little bit, but this all reminds me of a conversation I had with Billy Randall from Truckers Movement for Justice. So shout out Truckers. A couple months ago, we were talking, and I was kind of picking his brain about all the stuff that I was seeing in the news about the trucking industry, about there's not enough truckers and things like that. And he just said that's total bullshit. There's an overabundance of truckers. There's just not enough work to go around. So there's like all these different aspects of the industry that I'm not an expert either, obviously. So, but at the same time, when I saw that the industry group for the trucking industry came out against it, I thought, oh, that's interesting. But to get back on the rails, oh, yep.
No, just one last thing to say about trucking, because the only real experience I have with this is sort of tangential, where I used to work as an intermodal worker for the railroad in a facility where truckers would come in and pick up shipping containers and sort of take them to their final destination. So that was all sort of like local stuff. These guys were maybe crossing a couple state lines or things like that. But there was also the thing that we would deal with every so often, especially around peak season, where you would have the phenomena of either a container misses its train, right, and it's so hot, it's got to move, and they can't afford to like wait to try to send it on a later train or the next day or something like that. And so they actually will hire drivers to truck it across the country instead. But then there's also the phenomena of what they call gypsy drivers, which is probably not PC anymore. But basically these short-term temps, temporary drivers that get hired to deal with the sudden uptick in traffic over especially around peak season, where they were coming to the terminal for like the first time, and and they were picking up like UPS containers and things like that, and they didn't know where they were parked in it because they never did that before. And so I think that's sort of interesting, right? That idea of like there being a surplus of drivers out there and not enough work to go around, because we sort of saw that where all of a sudden there would be these drivers that we had never seen before, never interacted with before. They were, on these like short-term contracts for, big companies, and they were out there, right? But they weren't, they weren't around until the peak. So yeah, I don't know if that's useful or interesting or anything like that, but
no, I mean, I think it is for sure. Because I mean, one of the things Billy was telling me was that there's this overabundance of truckers. There's not enough work to go around, and so I mean, you mentioned it, how the Teamsters were basically broken up by the deregulations in the '70s. That they're kind of just all at each other's throats now. There's not really this sense of being organized or practicing solidarity. It's like I am desperately trying to take care of my family or take care of myself and pay the bills, and I need this work. So it's like this process of like stepping on everybody else, just trying to get the work. And so it's a pretty difficult situation out there for truckers. But again, thankfully there are organizations like Truckers Movement for Justice that are doing the work of trying to reorganize the trucking industry. But in terms of the this buyout of Norfolk Southern by Union Pacific, I know Warren Buffett had said a while ago that he was against any kind of merger. So, but as these things go in industry, you don't really get to decide those things. Like the tendency towards monopolization, for example, is like somehow everybody has to address it, or you just will end up consumed anyway. So I'm just wondering. I saw recently that now there's kind of talks about even BNSF and CSX maybe trying to consolidate, just because this is, I mean, if UP buys out Norfolk Southern, then it seems like in order to even survive, these other class ones are going to have to merge or what have you. And so if you want to talk a bit about that, like what does this mean for the other class ones who now may have to deal with Union Pacific being this, quote unquote, coast to coast railroad?
Yeah. So I think when the story sort of broke, and the rumors, I mean, it was amazing. This is maybe a bit of a side tangent, but it was amazing how quickly like this became a thing. I mean, I remember seeing some sort of like rumors about, Union Pacific buying Norfolk Southern, and it was like, that's crazy. Uh, and then all of a sudden, it was like, oh shit, like it's real. They're actually talking about this openly. It was amazing how quickly it sort of went from, this is an insane thing to consider, to, oh my God, they're actually gonna do it. But once you sort of got there, it was like, okay, no, it makes actually total sense. This is the sort of logical next step. It's just sort of the next step that nobody, was thinking that they would take. And so, yeah, back when the news first broke, we started talking about, and we highlighted that this was going to create pressure on CSX, and BNSF to merge, because of what you're talking about. I mean, so in one sense, our suspicion, right, our sort of maybe cynical take is that this merger is not going to work out well for anybody, right? But in a certain sense, if it does succeed in any aspect, it is going to succeed in sort of the sense of maybe short-term profit, and short-term cost cutting, because what's going to happen, and I'll bet anybody money on this, is that Norfolk Southern and Union Pacific, if they merge, are going to have this sort of corridor running north and south of all these interchange points, in cities like Chicago, and New Orleans and all these other cities sort of like up and down the Mississippi where these two big railroads meet. Um, and they're going to be looking hard at all of those locations and they're going to say, all right, we are this new company, UPNS. We have inherited all of the Norfolk Southern facilities, in these areas that we already had these Union Pacific facilities, right? So, in this city, we have where as Union Pacific, we just used to have like two big yards, and one big intermodal facility. Now we've got like a bunch of them. We used to have like these two diesel shops, and now we've got five. We have, these sort of these pools for covering these road trains, and now we've got even more of them. And so they're going to look hard at all of that stuff, and I think it's also going to extend to things like track, right? Oh, we have these two industrial spurs or these two main lines, um, and so it's going to result in them finding all of these redundancies, right? And I think it's going to be funny. Well, it's not going to be funny, but I think that's sort of that logic. You can, on one hand, you can sort of see it, you can sort of, okay, this makes sense from a certain perspective of, okay, you've just bought all this new stuff in the same area where you already had a bunch of stuff. See if there's some of it that you can shed, right? But they're talking about this merger like it's going to be the next great thing in railroading, and that they're actually going to be moving more freight and they're going to be moving it quicker. And again, sort of everything is going to be awesome after this merger. So, they're like with all of the PSR cuts, there's all these unintended consequences of reducing the capacity of the network and reducing the ability of the network to deal with things like, I don't know, a massive snowstorm or a big washout or, a major tunnel that needs a ton of rework or a huge derailment, something like that where, all right, they're going to like close all these yards and things like that, but then they want to move more freight. Well, you need space in yard to bring trains in, to classify them, to switch them out, to build the outbound trains. You need mainline space if you're going to change over crews. You need sidings where you can park the train for an hour while it waits for a recrew and stuff like that. And so, in a certain sense, to sort of get back to the question, it is going to give Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern a sort of an advantage over the other two big sort of east-west class ones, because when they do find all these yards, again, sort of setting aside the question of whether it's a good long-term idea to like close these yards, when they do find all of these like quote unquote redundancies, and they do cut, furlough, close facilities, abandoned track, all of that stuff, that is going to create a short-term sort of advantage, not necessarily in the sense of maybe moving more stuff, but in the sense of being able to go to the investors and the shareholders and say, look at all the expenses that we cut, look at all of the money that we're not spending anymore. We're gonna be an even more profitable company, not necessarily from expanding, right, but from cutting all of this stuff. And so that might, sort of in the short term, draw in more investors, sort of increase the confidence of current investors. It might make them a much more sort of appealing product on the stock market. And so BNSF and CSX are going to be under pressure if that happens to basically do the same thing. And so it's really interesting with you were mentioning Warren Buffett, right? Warren Buffett owns BNSF, right? And when this first, the merger between Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern started getting talked about, like you were saying, BNSF came out and Warren Buffett came out saying, like, we have no interest in buying CSX. We're not interested in that at all. We don't think it's a good idea. They announced a new agreement on intermodal stuff to sort of try to improve intermodal service. That runs between BNSF and CSX. But that's obviously not on the scale of like a buyout, right? And then what's happened since then is sort of BNSF said, no way, we're not interested in buying CSX. Activist, quote unquote, activist investor group at CSX has successfully pushed out the previous CSX CEO and brought in a new CEO who has a long background in other industries, but especially in the gas industry, of carrying out massive mergers. And so I think one way to look at this, it's sort of explicit that this activist investor group and Cora, who also attempted to take over Norfolk Southern a few years ago, basically said CSX needs to be more competitive in the face of this UPNS merger. It either needs to find either non-merger ways to stay more competitive, or it needs to merge. And if the current CEO and the current like CSX leadership is not basically willing to do that, then CSX needs new leadership. And so with that being the premise, they've basically brought in this new CEO who's willing to play ball, right? And so I think what we're going to see is, and BNSF has continued to sort of hold firm on this. We don't think it's a good idea. And they actually came out with a pretty detailed report on why they think the UPNS merger would be bad. And while I'm not, ever going to endorse anything that like Warren Buffett says, I do think it's interesting to sort of see from the corporate perspective why they think it would be bad for them, for the industry, et cetera. There's some sort of something similar with what went on with the CPKC merger. But I think what we're going to see is CSX, the new CSX CEO, is going to be doing, and sort of like the other new faces at the helm, everything they can to sort of make CSX a much more attractive, a much more, marketable product in terms of basically being salesmen for trying to sell off the company. So I don't think that the idea of a BNSF CSX merger is really dead. I think it's clearly not. I think what's going to happen is there's going to be more and more pressure to basically push this merger to happen, regardless of how everybody feels about it right now. Unless, of course, this whole saga goes on for long enough that UP, buys NS and that merger happens and it's massively disastrous. And then, and then BNSF and CSX get to sort of play, oh, we were right to remain separate. But I think, pending that, there's going to be this continued pressure for another merger like that. So so moving from sort of basically two or four big Class 1 railroads in the U.S. to down to two, right? Even closer to a monopoly.
Yeah, and I got to ask now, just because you said UPNS, and I was wondering, has any railroad workers been calling it UPNS?
Whether I can prove this or not, I have felt very strongly from the beginning that the new reporting mark needs to be UPNS, because, and I'm hoping whatever, whoever ends up in charge of rebranding this whole thing, I'm really hoping that they didn't go to like a public school, right? Or like hang out with kids, their age, when they. I'm hoping, we get the one guy in the world in charge of rebranding this thing who looks at, okay, Union Pacific, Norfolk Southern. We need 4 letters for the reporting mark. Why not just take the UP and the NS and put it together? We don't want the NS in front of the UP because, Union Pacific has bought Norfolk Southern, right? It's the senior partner. So we need UPNS. And I'm hoping we get the one guy in the world who doesn't look at that and go, hey, that kind of looks like UPNS. Because the bathroom graffiti is just going to write itself. It's going to be awesome. I'm holding out I'm lobbying for UPNS. I mean, hell, maybe I'll flip over to the other aisle. Maybe I'll support the merger if they promise that they'll name it UPNS.
And speaking of workers, and I mean, you had mentioned that in trying to remain competitive, which when I hear things like that, remaining competitive and all this, then you mentioned all this like cost cutting. I mean, that always translates in my mind to, oh, we're going to screw over the workers. We're going to continue gutting the workforce and all that. So I'm wondering, when we see things like the buyout and in potentially even further buyouts down the road, what kinds of impacts can we expect workers to feel like? I mean, there's going to be, I'm just assuming layoffs, furloughs, just combining jobs. Like, a person that used to do one job is now going to do 2 or 3. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's already been kind of happening on the railroads. But so just, like, what can we expect to see if this thing goes through and this kind of turns into a major trend on the railroads? But also maybe taking a look at what jobs are the most vulnerable, because I know there are quite a few that even before the conversations about the merger, but they're the threat of automation and things like that. And again, trying to, combine these jobs and have a single person doing, 4 or 5 people's jobs. I mean, so how is that going to be exacerbated by this merger?
Yeah. I mean, I think anybody who wasn't born yesterday, right, can sort of see the writing on the walls. And I think it's interesting, because again, the sort of the PR for all of this, they were saying, oh, it's actually going to create more jobs. I don't think anyone ever believed that, right? And I think it's sort of proof in the pudding that, you have a major rail union basically agreeing to support the merger on the premise of, they've pinky promised us that none of our members will lose jobs, right? Well, if job cuts weren't on the table, right? If it was going to expand the workforce, then why do you feel like you need to like sign this agreement, right? So yeah, I think it's going to be bad. It's going to be really bad for workers on a whole bunch of different fronts. I think in the immediate term, like in the immediate aftermath of the merger, it's going to be a nightmare because I think the sort of handover is not going to be smooth. So I mean, it's worth plugging. A bunch of our members were on Max Alvarez's podcast about this merger, and a bunch of guys who were on that episode had lived through mergers of various railroads that they had worked for in their time. Some bigger, some smaller. I've personally seen in my area sort of the CSX buying out Pan Am. So, not on the same scale, but there's sort of like a common thread between all of these mergers of it's a nightmare. Everything that used to sort of work, at best, for certain definitions of work, I guess, right? But it's upended like overnight. And some of it's like incredibly like almost comical, like technical screw ups. Like I mentioned CPKC buying out, or CP buying out KCS, Canadian Pacific buying out Kansas City Southern. And that was technically sort of a merger of two class ones, right? But on a very different scale, in the sense of they are class ones by the definition of, their revenue is greater than whatever the requirement is, but they're not on the same scale as um, Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern. Um, they had the problem of basically the you know and there's a I've spoken with a guy who works with sort of like the data of um, at CPKC and sort of like on the technical back end of like information technology stuff like that, right? But like basically the cutover from two separate computer systems, two separate inventory systems, two separate systems for tracking trains and all of this other stuff into one. It was completely bungled, completely screwed up, and it created and the CPKC CEO has gone on record about this as a reason why this merger is a bad idea. Is he basically, went on record saying like, listen, when we merged, when we bought KCS and we merged all of our operations, it went so poorly that it created a months long backup where we were just trying to, just sort out what the heck had happened with where these cars ended up and where these trains ended up and all of this other stuff. This is also what happened when Conrail got carved up by Norfolk Southern and CSX. It's happened with all of these mergers. Is sort of in the immediate short term, it becomes a nightmare. Everybody's going to be pulling massive amounts of overtime. They're going to be calling extras as soon as you're rested. Your phone's going to ring. They're going to be anybody who doesn't have the hours of service protections, like a lot of the mechanical crafts. Those guys are going to be pulling doubles. There's going to be, dispatching confusion. There's going to be new managers in charge of territory that they've never, managed before. They don't know all the like little secrets and tools of the trade and how to make this all work. Right, we're already in a situation where both of these railroads are running on very slim margins, right, where anything goes wrong and it becomes a nightmare to try to sort out. So I think that's going to be miserable for everybody involved, on all levels. It's going to be incredibly confusing figuring out like um, even like basic day-to-day stuff. Who do you call, right, when you need like paperwork? But in sort of like the long term, right, like we were talking about, I mean, they're going to be looking at cutting train crews, right? They're going to say, all right, we have these freight pools, here in, I don't know, St. Louis or something like that. We now have two big freight pools, sort of one from the Norfolk Southern side and one from the Union Pacific side. Let's just combine both of them and then cut off like 20 spots or whatever. Um, and force those guys to go exercise their seniority somewhere else, right? So even if nobody gets sort of like laid off or fired, they might get forced out of the territory that they've been in, and all right, you are going to have to use your seniority and go somewhere else, right, and bump somebody else off of a job somewhere else. um, they're going to look at hacking away at all of the like mechanical crafts. They're going to say, all right, we have X number of car inspectors, for all of these yards in this one area. Since we're going to be looking at closing these yards, we're not going to need so many car inspectors. So, let's get rid of, 30 of those jobs again. And those guys can go exercise their seniority somewhere else and, hey, move across the country or quit your job. It's up to you. Same thing with like intermodal stuff, machinists, doing locomotive stuff. If they're gonna abandon yards, that's going to mean less maintenance away jobs. If they're going to abandon main lines or industrial tracks, anything that's got signals on it, not only is it going to affect maintenance away guys, it's going to affect signal maintainers. I really think there's no sort of like stone that gets they're going to turn over every stone. They're gonna say like, oh, we have all these yards in this area, these newly inherited yards. Let's just make yard masters responsible for more yards, and let's cut these other yard master positions. Let's make these dispatchers. Let's consolidate all our dispatchers. I don't know where, UP and NS are. Actually, I think NS is dispatched out of Atlanta, right? Like maybe they're just going to tell all of the dispatchers that live in Atlanta or in the area around Atlanta, hey, you're all going to get moved out to the West Coast. If you don't like it, then you got to quit. So I think it's going to get really bad, really nasty. And then sort of like you combine that with the industry trends of sort of automation. I mean, there's more and more usage of remote control locomotives. But then also there's been all of the drama around automated track inspection, that has long-term implications for not only, sort of safety and everything like that, but sort of the maintenance away stuff. They've been talking about, it feels like forever, sort of automated inspection portals where a train will sort of roll through this gantry that has a ton of cameras all around it, and it'll inspect the cars on the go and things like that, so you don't need as many car inspectors and to perform actual human inspection. The locomotives are more and more just rolling computers. They're who knows, maybe they're gonna get it to the point where like the locomotive inspects itself and then just sends on a report to the corporation, and they get to axe machinists that way. And so I mean, it's bad, right? It's not, I don't think anyone's looking at this and saying, "Oh yeah, this is going to be a lot more work for me." We're gonna have a ton more guys. The long-term prospects in this industry are only getting better and better. Yeah.
And that makes it all the more surprising that with the whole situation with Smart TD, which I got to ask you about, that there, from my understanding and like from what I saw, Smart TD had released a statement against the merger a while ago, relatively shortly followed by an approval of the merger. So what types of things is Union Pacific promising union workers? I mean, it just seems like with everything that you've mentioned in all it just doesn't seem like there's anything possibly good about this thing in terms of impacts on the workforce. So, I mean, I am not going to sit here and pretend like I know more than union railroad workers. I mean, obviously I don't. So it's just like really shocking.
You might. You
okay.
might. I'll just say it. Some of us not that intelligent.
Yeah, but I mean, it seems like at the very least, like everybody knows, like, okay, we can see what way the wind's blowing. Like, what the hell? It just blows my mind. Like, why would the leadership of Smart TD approve of this thing?
Yeah, it's a question I ask myself daily. So as a member of Smart TD, if whoever listens to this at whatever international office, whatever I'm gonna say here is who knows if anything will actually come of it, but our unions are very interesting holdouts of sort of the craft unions that they started out as. I mean, most of them didn't even really start out as unions, but now over 100 years ago, all of these unions sort of were craft unions built around the idea of we represent one specific craft, one specific kind of railroad worker, and we're narrowly interested in representing that one specific craft. And it's that outlook that underlines all of this, in my opinion. And I think there's there's a lot that could be said about all of this. And it's hard to pick exactly the best way to start. But I think the place that I'm starting from is, let's look at what has been said, basically. So the initial statement, you're right. So most of the unions, with the exception of like TWU, which doesn't represent all that many freight railroad workers, but TWU came out swinging with a really good statement about why the merger, terrible idea. Most of the rest of the unions came out with statements that were, again, like I mentioned previously, like none of us were born yesterday, right? A lot of the unions came out with statements that felt like they had been written by someone who was born yesterday. A lot of sort of like, well, let's wait and see. We don't know the details. We can't condemn something that hasn't happened yet. We can't like say for sure this is going to be bad because we haven't seen any details. Which I think is incredibly naive. I think everybody recognizes it's incredibly naive. We've seen mergers before. We know what mergers look like. We know what they do. And I think everybody on a gut instinct level recognizes that if the company thinks it's good, it's probably bad for us in some way, shape, or form, right? And so, but the initial Smart TD statement was one of the better ones in the sense that it was running through a laundry list sort of current problems with Union Pacific and with Norfolk Southern in terms of like Smart TD's specific experience, but also sort of generalized stuff. Like they noted, for example, the fact that Union Pacific was found a couple of years ago to have been coaching its employees. Basically, there was a investigation into the internal safety culture at Union Pacific, and so the investigators were going and speaking with Union Pacific workers and sort of trying to get their honest opinion of whether they felt, it's a safe workplace, safety's taken seriously, everything like that. And it came out that basically Union Pacific had been going and with all of its workers had been telling them what they should be saying in the course of this investigation, right? And other things like with Norfolk Southern. And so that statement was okay, right? In the sense of it didn't explicitly say like, this is bad, we're going to oppose it, but it sort of said, okay, these are not like corporations that we trust, right? Or anything like that. And then, and then a couple of weeks later, or like a couple of months later, they come out with this statement saying, basically, we are now in favor of the Union Pacific-Norfolk Southern merger because we have been given job protections. So again, this idea of sort of like our members first, right, is the logic that they're using here, or what they're claiming they're using here, basically. And again, nobody's seen that. This is not a contract. This is not like a legally binding thing. It's not clear what does any of these protections mean, right? Really practically. But basically, what they are saying is that they have a promise from the two companies that would now become one company, Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern, that anybody who currently works in a position that is represented by Smart TD will not lose their job.
It seems like to me though that it's almost like a sort of like a Lucy with the football and Charlie Brown situation where like they could say, yeah, we're going to guarantee that your jobs will be protected, but it's only in the context of the merger. That doesn't mean that there can't be some other made up bullshit excuse to start laying off workers. Is that
well, right?
Yeah.
And this is the point. Nobody has seen this agreement. Nobody knows how strong these protections are, or what these protections mean. So, like, their jobs are protected. What does that mean? So my first question is, okay, the way that they're talking about it, the big giant open question mark is, okay, what about future employees, right? What about people who aren't like grandfathered into this thing? People who are not currently employed by Union Pacific or Norfolk Southern? Is this going to create like a new second tier of people hired after the merger? We've seen that happen on the railroads a ton, where you have all these like prior right seniority agreements when two railroads merge, or when like the Halloween agreement, people who are hired after I forget what date it was that basically different workers will sort of be subject to different protections, and the new guys get screwed. I mean, we've seen like this kind of two-tier stuff in tons of other industries. It was a big factor during like the UPS contract battle, the UAW contract battle at the big three automakers, where sort of this fight to try to end this sort of like second tier, this lower tier of workers, which will eventually replace the older workers. I mean, that's always the danger, right? Is you sign this agreement, the current employees are protected. Well, the current employees are only going to last for so long. They're gonna retire, or they're going to get fired in the future. They're going to get taken out on discipline. They're going to get forced out of the industry. Who knows? Some of them are going to get maimed. Some of them are going to get killed, and slowly it will just be, they will all be replaced by the new, crop of people who are not protected, right? What does that mean? What does that mean for the long-term health, not just of the industry, but for the union? Right, where you're selling out the future members. So that's one problem, right? Current employees. Okay, then the next problem is protections. What does that mean? Does that mean you get to hang on to your seniority? Well, that's fine, but what happens when, like we were talking about earlier, they cut 20 mechanical jobs out of whatever terminal? You get to keep your seniority, but now there's less jobs on offer, right, in this location. So now you have to move somewhere else or quit, right? What does job protections mean? Does that mean that no positions are going to get cut? Does that mean that people get to hang on to their seniority? Does that, there's a whole bunch of different, like, the devil is in the details, right? So that's sort of a big question. If you sort of accept okay, at least this is good for Smart TD members who are currently employed by Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern, if you accept that logic and you accept that this is good for them, at least in the short term, there's still all these questions of, okay, how good is it? But also, what does it mean for the long term? And then, we need to open it up to bigger questions of what sort of precedent does this set? How does this affect other crafts? How does this affect the long-term sort of health of the industry? Because this is, to sort of bring up these bigger questions. What Smart TD, generally speaking, represents conductors. what good is it going to be if we are the if conductors are the last man standing on a railroad where the track's inspected by robots, the train that you are operating, that you're servicing, whatever, because these are also the same companies that want to get rid of the onboard conductor and move to the sort of like ground based conductor. Um, well, what happens when these trains are being inspected by automated inspection portals, and what happens when what good is it to be the last man standing on a railroad, where everything else is being replaced by robots, and everything's getting worse and worse and worse. Uh, is that really like good for the members? Because what this is doing is it's sort of they're able to carrot and the stick, right? The carrot is if you're an early adopter, right? If you get on board early, and support the merger, you get the carrot, right? You get to hang on. Your craft gets to exist for a little bit longer versus the stick. If you're the last at the table, last dog at the bowl starves, right? The implied threat is okay. Every other union now needs to get on board with this, and then whoever is the holdouts, there's going to be consequences. Um, and so I think that gets back to like this central question of like the idea of narrowly representing your craft, being the best representative for your craft, because that's a genuine argument that I hear from people that are opposed to like coordinated bargaining, unified bargaining, all of the crafts, all of the unions bargaining together. You hold out one for all and all for one, right? You hold out, to make sure that every craft's concerns are addressed. Every craft gets the kind of agreement and the demands that they need. People will say, that actually they prefer the craft system because you want a union that you want to make sure that your interests aren't sort of like lost in the mix, right? You want to make sure that you're getting the best representation possible for your craft. And I want to question, does that even work? Because Smart TD itself is an amalgamation of a bunch of different craft unions. The Smart TD used to be called the United Transportation Union, and it got renamed to the United Transportation Union in the 60s when like four different craft unions merged together, basically because they were, dying out, really. And they didn't really have the basis to keep going as like an independent union. I mean, the reason why it's now called SMART is because the UTU then merged with the sheet metal workers, which is not a railroad, like union, right? Because I think they needed they needed declining membership. They needed the infrastructure, the support of this other union. But like the UTU was formed out of this merger of, among others, conductors, switchmen, brakemen. So, okay, if we accept this logic of craft unionism protects crafts, but does it? Switchmen are gone. Brakemen are mostly gone. I mean, it was earlier this year or last year that BNSF went ahead and got rid of a bunch of the remaining brakemen. I mean, you look around rail labor, and all of these unions either contain within them the remnants of older craft unions, or you see like a graveyard of craft unions that have died out because their crafts have died out. So this idea of like, we're going to sign this sweetheart deal because it protects conductors, why should we believe that? It hasn't worked. All of these other crafts are gone, and we're eventually going to be next on the chopping block. And doesn't this create that exact situation where an individual craft can get picked off because every other union agrees to support the merger? And who knows, I don't know, the Boilermakers are the one holdouts, or the TWU are the one holdouts. The TWU one would be complicated, but I don't know. Whoever is the one holdout. Engineers are the holdout, right? Union, and then because they didn't sign on to the agreement, now I don't know. Now UPNS makes it their life mission to lobby the federal government to, remove the two-person crew rule and give conductors like remote control on like 3 mile long, 150-mile runs. And you get rid of the engineers, and now it's just a single guy, remote controlling the engine and the entire train, and the conductors get the engineers work, and the engineers are eliminated. I mean, that's the sort of thing that we set ourselves up for with this kind of strategy. And it's not even the first, like, the smart TD thing is really sort of egregious. The smart TD sweetheart deal. But I want to make it very clear, and this isn't because like I'm like a smart TD member and I want to like protect my union or something like that. This is following a precedent that's been set for a long time. I mean, in 2014, again, it was smart. There was the agreement with BNSF that would have effectively created the one-man crew, to the detriment of the engineers. And Smart TD again made this agreement because they were sort of like, well, Smart and BLE, the engineers union, were sort of jockeying of, okay, if they're going to reduce it down to one-man crews, who's going to be the last guy standing? That's what we're, instead of uniting and fighting to protect the two-person crew standard, we're gonna jockey to see who's gonna be the last guy standing, who's gonna get the remote control work, right? But even more recently, at Norfolk Southern, I mentioned before, Ancora tried to take over Norfolk Southern, basically in the wake of like the East Palestine derailment and everything like that. Ancora comes in and says, "Hey, Norfolk Southern hasn't done PSR hard enough. They haven't PSR'd it, to 100 to the max, right? They need to cut deeper. They need to boost profits even more. So we're activist investors, and we want to take over, and we want to bring in a new CEO, and this, that, and the other thing." And the Maintenance of Way Union and the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen agreed. They supported the Ancora takeover. This is a group that is explicitly saying Norfolk Southern needs to cut deeper, and these two unions agree to support the takeover, again on that sort of like sweetheart deal basis, right? Like Ancora clearly must have promised them that once they're in the driver's seat at Norfolk Southern, engineers are going to get protected. They're going to get some kind of improvement. Maintenance of way guys are going to get some kind of improvement. And all of the other unions opposed the takeover. Now, it's worth saying that the way that they opposed the takeover was by expressing support for the current leadership of Norfolk Southern, which was the same, East Palestine leadership, right? The same, contract battle, labor does not contribute to profit leadership. So we have this situation where rail labor divides itself over which faction of PSR pushers to support. I mean, neither of these guys are going to be good for us in the long run, right? But this is the only way they seem to be able to think about things, is in terms of, we got to get ours. We got to screw over the other crafts, the other unions. We've got to be early adopters. We want to be the last guys standing, without any sort of consideration for what is this going to do in the long term, and what is this going to do for like contract negotiations. What happens when Smart TD is the one that's late on all this, and we're the holdouts on something, and all of a sudden we're the ones that are going to be the get the stick, right? And are not going to get the protections. I mean, is anyone going to look back and say, hey, gee, maybe we really shouldn't have like signed this sweetheart deal in the first place? So it's so flawed and it's so absurd, and it's what's gotten us to where we are now, where all of these crafts have disappeared, where railroad employment is down, where our raises are not keeping up with inflation, where the quality of life is so terrible, like all of this stuff. And this one example sort of encapsulates all of the sort of strategy of rail labor that's gotten us to this point where we are now. And I think this is just the thing. When do we draw a line in the sand, right? And say, like, hell no, we go no further. We're not willing to accept this anymore. I think that's sort of like the question that's being posed here. But yeah, I mean, that's my rant, really long rant over for your very simple question of how the hell anyone can think this is a good idea. It's just, yeah, it's baffling. As a rank and file member of this union, as someone who works every day for the railroad, who is not a full-time union officer or anything like that, it's so baffling how anybody could look at this and say this is a good deal and this is going to, in the long term, like create the best situation for our membership, because it isn't, right? It's just not. Even if we are the last guy standing, I don't want to be the last guy standing on a railroad where everything else is robots, because that job is not going to be a job worth having. I don't care how much they're going to pay us. I don't care how good the retirement is. I won't make it to retirement if the train's being run by a robot and inspected by a robot and dispatched by a robot, and I'm the only person in a yard of 100-ton cars rolling around getting kicked by robots. I'm not going to make it to retirement. But yeah, it's just it's hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah, it's being the last man standing on a sinking ship. Like it's
right. Yeah, exactly.
And yeah, I mean, in that, yeah, what you've just described is this sort of hangover of craft unionism. I mean, it's so frustrating because, looking at labor history, the rail unions could be the strongest unions in the country. If they would embrace this sort of bold militant industrial unionism and just kind of recognize that it's much easier to get picked off by your employer if you're separated like that. Like if you're only caring about a small section of the workforce instead of embracing the entire workforce and bringing everybody together and fighting, for whatever you'd like to in your contracts or what have you. I mean, that, and like you said, being all for one and one for all and holding out in helping each other get the best contracts possible. It's just incredibly frustrating because there's so much potential there. But just thinking about, mentioning East Palestine and then thinking about what happens when robots take over all these jobs, thinking about this merger and sort of what this consolidation of corporate power means. There's these different sections of folks that will be impacted by it. Of course, the railroad workers are, at the top of that list, but then there's also shippers and trackside communities. And, thinking about the American Chemistry Council coming out against the merger, the smaller shippers are already getting screwed left and right by the Class 1 railroads. So I guess it's sort of like a two-part question. Like one, I mean, how do you foresee this impacting smaller shippers who are already getting screwed, already being neglected? Will there be even more shippers that are, cut from the railroads and forced to move to trucks? And then, thinking about what is being shipped and thinking about derailments and things like that. And we've been talking about this operating ratio obsession and PSR and all this stuff. Definitely means more dangerous conditions for trackside communities. So thinking about the things that are being shipped, all the cost cutting, I mean, it seems like it's definitely going to be, these trackside communities are going to be in an even more vulnerable, if that's possible, position than they were before with this merger. Is that all fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, yeah, shippers are going to get screwed. I mean, the long term, the sort of like long term goal of the railroads has been to drive away um, customers that are not sufficiently like high volume, high yield, right? Basically, the idea is like, okay, we only want to run trains to a customer if if we're going to get a really high, high, uh, profit out of this. Basically, it's not worth getting out of bed to like switch this little factory that gets like one or two cars, like every other day. That's not worth uh, employing a train crew and maintaining a serving yard somewhere, and switching those cars, and it's not worth it, regardless of like common carrier obligations, right? And things like uh, basically the fact that all of these companies are sort of like captive, right? They have one industrial spur or one siding, and it's only served by one railroad that owns the track that it connects to, and so they have no other option, right? It's not like they can go, hey, we're off of a CSX main line. We're gonna go. CSX is not giving us the service that we want, so we're gonna go with Norfolk Southern, right? It's not like just hiring a different trucking company. Uh, so these smaller shippers have been getting screwed for a long time in favor of sort of the industry trending towards like these like transloading type facilities, right? Their dream is that they get rid of all of these little shippers, um, all these individual factories and warehouses and facilities, and that get a handful of cars, and push those customers to instead um, do sort of like last mile type trucking, like that intermodal example I was describing earlier, of we're going to run one train that goes to this giant, this big facility where there's like a dozen tracks, and that train is going to get broken up into all of these different tracks, and the customer is going to have to come to that facility and unload their cars of their product, or load up the cars with their product, instead of us having to maintain enough locals and maintain enough track and train everybody to the proper standard of knowing how to go and switch these individual facilities and things like that. And it lets us abandon all these industrial spurs and combine all these trains. We don't have to have all these switchers that build all these little local trains. We don't have to have all these car inspectors that inspect all these little local trains. We don't have to have machinists that maintain all of these little local engines. Now we can just have giant 3 mile long trains that are point A to point B. They don't stop anywhere along the way. They get assembled in a big yard. They get split up in a big yard. The customer comes and loads and unloads themselves. And if they don't like it, then they can just truck it, instead of having the convenience of these cars come to their individual facilities and things like that. So that's been sort of like the long term thing. And regardless of the fact that these rail companies have an obligation, right? They have a contract to provide a certain standard of service. They'll just ignore it, right? And they'll give a bunch of excuses, and they'll try to drive customers away. So it's bizarre. I mean, I've been doing T&E, train and engine service, for less than 5 years, and where I work, it's all locals. It's all servicing individual customers. And it's amazing. Everywhere you go, you see places, you see buildings that clearly used to be rail customers at some point. There's still a siding in there, or there used, clearly there used to be a siding. There's all these doors where they used to get, boxcars and unload and load the boxcars. And everywhere you go, it's like a graveyard of oh, look, that used to be a customer. And everybody that you talk to that's older, that's got more seniority, they'll tell you, oh, that used to be a customer. Oh, that used to be a branch line. Oh, we used to go here. We used to service these guys. And sort of where all those stories end is, yeah, they don't get rail service anymore. We stopped servicing them. They truck it all now, or that company moved out and now somebody else owns the building. And and so it's this incredibly depressing thing of like, what future does that mean for me? But also to think about, like all of these shippers, that's what's happened to so many of these shippers already, with sort of the consolidation that's already happened. So with this mega merger, it's going to get even worse. I mean, if this is a mega merger that's being driven by the idea of we want to make maximum profit while spending as little as possible, then they're going to look at cutting locals, right? It's hard to think about how, like, anybody, if you're kind of like small fry now for Union Pacific or for Norfolk Southern, where you're already having a problem, like getting someone on the phone and being like, hey, we haven't gotten any service. We haven't gotten a switch in like, days. We have cars. We can see the cars like in the yard. Is someone going to come and switch us? If you're already having a hard time getting like Norfolk Southern to give you like proper service, it's hard to imagine that you're going to somehow get treated better by an even bigger, you're going to be an even smaller fly on an even bigger horse's ass, right? Like they're not going to care. They're only going to care about, these massive customers that get tons of cars, or setting up these transloading facilities. And so it's not going to be good for the shippers. And it's a knock-on thing, right? Because talking about the fact that like the railroad, and this sort of gets to like the trackside community thing, and maybe this is the segue. The railroad it doesn't just like employ railroad workers. It also impacts the economies of every city and state that it touches. So I worked between railroad jobs. I worked at a factory that got rail service. It was a union job. There was still a pension. I was represented by United Steelworkers. And so to sort of think about, okay, when the service dries up, it's not just going to like impact like the business owners, right? What happens if there's a workforce at a factory or a warehouse or something like that, where their jobs only exist because they load and unload these rail cars. They make something that then gets shipped out by rail, or they unload like ingredients, chemicals, or something like that from these rail cars, and then the rail service dries up. I mean, they're gonna get laid off. They're gonna the company might say, screw it, we're gonna move out. We're going to move to somewhere where we do get rail service, or where we can truck more conveniently, or something like that. And everybody's going to lose their jobs, and that place is going to get shut down. So it's a knock-on effect on everything. I mean, I was mentioning the sort of like service crisis, the crew shortage crisis of a few years ago. I mean, some of the testimony was from like the agricultural industry, talking about how the railroad's failure to be able to like deliver like pesticides and grain and like all this other, like it was gonna impact planting season. I mean, the railroad like potentially could have single-handedly created a food shortage, right? There was testimony about how like the ability to purify drinking water was in danger in some places because of the railroad service crisis. So like if there is as we're sort of suspecting, a knock-on effect of UPNS service degradation on a scale that we haven't seen before, right? Like one transcontinental railroad that touches every part of the United States experiences a massive service degradation, massive service disruption. It's going to be bad for shippers, not just in the sense of like these individual business owners who are going to have to take take a hit and truck some stuff and less profit. It's going to impact all the workers, right? It's going to impact and then like the idea of like, okay, you're going to close all of these rail yards, these redundant rail yards. Well, those are like some good jobs. I mean, we talk about like the quality of life on the railroad sucking for railroad workers, but in the grand scheme of things, it's like the railroads are like the building trades, right? It's like I was always told, if you don't go to college and you want to like have a job where you make good money, you go to the building trades or you go to the railroad, right? The railroad is where dumbasses go to make money. Well, what's going to happen to all these like railroad cities, railroad towns? And there are towns out there still now today where like the big employer is the railroad. When these facilities like get shuttered, all those good jobs dry up. That's going to have a knock-on effect in the community in terms of the opportunity to have, a union job, a good paycheck, a good retirement, because the railroad employment continues to plummet. But sort of to get onto the sort of like more immediately sort of like deadly question of sort of trackside community safety. Yeah, I mean, the railroads have been lobbying forever for like the single person crew, for now, automated track inspection, for all of this stuff. And they've almost gotten it in a lot of cases, or they have gotten it in certain cases. And, they spend huge amounts of money on lobbying. I mean, they advertise their PACs to their employees. They try to convince employees to donate to like the railroad's political action fund in order to lobby, because they sort of say, oh, what's good for us is good for you. We want, pro railroad policies so that, we can create more jobs and this, that, and the other thing. Right. But that's not what they're doing with that lobbying money. But the point is, imagine the combined power, the combined political power of Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern, and their ability to lobby for what they want, their ability to buy senators and representatives and local politicians and throw money around until they get what they want. It's going to be disastrous. I mean, the railroads in their current form have managed to completely avoid making any sort of meaningful change in the wake of East Palestine. The East Palestine disaster happened. The cleanup's been a nightmare. It hasn't happened, really. I mean, Norfolk Southern lawyers bullied residents into a settlement that is now a bunch of them are saying they regret ever agreeing to it, right? But none of the industry-wide problems that were sort of like identified with East Palestine, right? That for the first time, it's not just railroad workers talking about like defect detectors. How are those regulated? Inspections. How frequently does a train have to be inspected? How much time do inspectors get to look at, cars to try to find things and fix them? How many times was that train parked and then recrewed and then, run again, and that bearing cooled down and heated up? And how big was that train, and how poorly built was that train with so much of the weight on the rear? And and all of that stuff, there's been no change, right? There has been no improvement on any of that. The Rail Safety Act of 2023 or whatever hasn't passed. It's never going to pass. I mean, this is it was a disastrous year for the railroads in 2023. Every time they put even like a single car on the ground, it was like headline news, because everybody was worried it was going to be the next East Palestine. That threat is still there. That anything could be the next East Palestine. It could happen tomorrow. It's only a matter of time, and nothing has changed. And so the idea of like our trackside communities going to be less safe because of this, I mean, in one sense, no, in the sense that they're probably going to be just as unsafe, but that's not a positive thing, right? But in a lot of ways, yeah, it is going to get worse because of those, like what we were talking about looking for ways to cut. There's going to be a knock-on effect from that. But even just aside from like the question of safety and the question of jobs, there's also sort of the question of access to transit. There's no, Amtrak doesn't own very much track. There's not a lot of track that's owned by state level governments. So most passenger service, if it exists, is running on track that's maintained and dispatched and controlled by the freight railroads. And so, UPNS gonna, give a shit any more of a shit than they do now about like on time performance of like local commuter trains or regional service or anything like that? Amtrak and these passenger trains are getting treated like second class citizens now on this territory. There's no way that that's going to like get better under a combined Union Pacific-Norfolk Southern. So, people's access to transit is not going to improve. It's probably going to get worse. So it's just like I was saying earlier, it's hard to sort of segment this out because the railroad touches everything. Everything is connected to the railroad in one way, shape, or form. So like the full impact of a merger like this is really impossible to sort of see because there's going to be ways that this impacts things that seem like completely unconnected to us right now. And so it's just, yeah, that's the reason why passengers associations give a shit about a freight railroad merger. That's the reason why shippers give a shit. That's the reason why environmentalists and safety advocates, give a shit about this. That's why railroad workers who aren't, don't work for CSX, don't work for UP or don't work for NS give a shit about this, because it's going to affect everything.
Yeah, and before I let you go here, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about Railroad Workers United gives a shit about it and is spearheading a campaign, and just wanted to give you a chance to talk about it a bit, how you're fighting back, and what folks can do to get involved and learn more.
Yeah, so we weren't born yesterday. A lot, like I said, lots of us have had experiences with mergers, but lots of us have just had experience with the industry, had experience with the unions, had experience with all of these sort of parties to this whole thing. The government, the regulatory body that's eventually going to approve this thing, corporate politicians bought and paid for. And so, yeah, we're saying this merger, terrible idea, needs to be opposed and needs to be meaningfully opposed. We think there's a case to do that. I mean, so just setting aside the fact that there's a, you know, strange bedfellows here, right? Of like shippers and workers. You know, I would love to be doing battle with the shippers over like them wanting me to switch them like 3 days or 3 times a day, right? Like that would be a good problem to have. I would love to be fighting the shippers over, hey, they're unreasonable demands on train crews, right? But the fact is here, you know, we want the same thing. Really is more work, more service. So I think there is sort of like the potential to oppose this thing and the potential to fight back. There's a whole bunch of different groups of people that are going to be negatively affected by this, and sort of collectively, we have a lot of power. Um, but most importantly, railroad workers have the power. We believe that railroad workers, rank and file railroad workers, have the ability to stop this merger in its tracks. We think we actually have the most power out of everyone in this situation because we're the ones that make the railroads work. Um, and so, yeah, we're opposing the merger. We're calling on the unions to oppose the merger. We're calling on the unions to actually mobilize the membership and do a coordinated and escalating campaign, you know, of real opposition to this. You know, forget strongly worded letters. We need to be out in these communities having public meetings. We need to be organizing rallies. We need to be doing informational, you know, picketing. You know, where we're drawing attention to this, where we're mobilizing the real source of union strength, which is not hiring the right people to bargain behind closed doors, but it's the rank and file membership of the union, the strength in numbers. Um, so, yeah, that's what we believe in. We think this merger can be stopped. We think right now there's a lot of pressure to sort of ram this thing through as quickly as possible. Um, but we shouldn't be treating this as a done deal. And I think something that I've personally been trying to read up as much as possible on is I think there's the really great example of the campaign against the Kroger Albertsons merger, where these two sort of like grocery giants wanted to merge, and these UFCW locals led a campaign to stop the merger, right? And I think rail labor can learn from that, right? If grocery store workers can do it, there's no reason why we can't too, right? So so yeah, so that's the most important thing for us right now is, you know, we've been surveying railroad workers, we've been discussing with railroad workers, we've got stickers that are going to be coming out, leaflets, um, that we're talking to the media, we're talking to our coworkers about why we think the merger should be opposed, the fact that it can be opposed, in our opinion. Um, and so we're doing things like that. I mean, we had a town hall meeting. You know, I think it's worth sort of saying here, like, I don't I don't get the sense that Union Pacific workers and Norfolk Southern workers have been given sort of a democratic forum, the rank and file, where they can say how they feel about this thing. I don't think they've been polled by anybody, by the employers, by anybody. Uh, and so we had this town hall where it's basically, hey, any railroad worker, you know, you get the floor for a couple of minutes and talk about what you think about the merger. If you think it's great, say it's great. If you think it's terrible, say it's terrible and why. Um, and so we're looking to build a campaign along those lines. Railroad workers in the lead. And so we have a committee that's organizing the campaign, after that first event, we've got these stickers coming, and we're going to be organizing more stuff going forward. But the actual question of how do we fight this, I think that's going to depend on what do people think. I mean, we know that there's a lot of people who are opposed to this. We know there's a bunch of different avenues to try and block this thing, but it's going to be a question of getting people involved and getting people organized and actually doing the work. If you're a railroad worker out there and you think this is bad, the next question is, what are you doing to stop it? And if you do think it's bad, you need to get involved, because a handful of us can't stop it for the rest of us. We need everybody. And so we have on our website, railroadworkersunited.org, we have a page about the merger, where we've been collecting all of the interviews that we've been giving and everything that we've been writing about it, and all of the sort of other industry coverage of this. And we're gonna be using that as sort of like the one-stop shop, right, for upcoming actions and things like that. We'll put them out over email and social media and all of that stuff. So basically, if you want to get involved in the campaign as an individual or as an organization, reach out to us on the website, and we're happy to work with anybody. You were mentioning Truckers for Justice, longtime allies, close friends. This is going to touch everybody and everything. So, despite the fact that we believe very strongly that this campaign needs to be sort of run by railroad workers, and with railroad workers in the lead, we think there's a space for everybody, environmentalists, safety advocates, all of that stuff. And I think it's the last thing I guess I'd plug is, I think the relevance to sort of the Public Rail Now campaign, right, is that and I'm writing an article for our newsletter about this. Like, this is the long-term trend of the industry, is these mergers and consolidations. And so the only future that railroad workers have to look forward to right now is a future of mega mergers and PSR pushers, right? These corporate executives that are going to buy up all of these different railroads and sell them to Wall Street, and they're gonna cut jobs, and they're gonna cut service, and they're gonna close yards, and they're gonna lay people off, all in the quest for profit, right? For that operating ratio. And that's the only future we have to look forward to. And then, the only thing that stands in their way is us, maybe a friendly regulator or two, but those guys can get bought out. So what's the alternative, right? Like, I always jokingly ask like older coworkers of mine, I say, hey, just curious, have you ever seen it get better? And the answer is no, it's only ever gotten worse. Everybody has these stories of like the golden years when it was awesome to work for the railroad. Nobody has any stories of like, oh, the railroad got better, right? Like, it improved. My life has gotten better. My job is better than it was 20 years ago, 10 years ago. Nobody So is this the only future we have to look forward to, or is there an alternative out there? And I think that's where public ownership comes up, right? What if the railroads were not run on the basis of the operating ratio and profit, and only servicing high volume customers and high volume, passenger markets and things like that? What if there's just this crazy concept of the railroads exist for one reason and one reason only, to move people and goods as quickly and efficiently and safely as possible, instead of trying to make money off of it? And that's what public ownership's about, right? Like, what could it be instead of, two corporate transcontinental mega mergers? What if instead there was a single transcontinental system that was streamlined and rationally planned and organized on the basis of moving stuff instead of making money? And it was run by people that we got to elect, people like normal people like us, and railroad workers get a seat at the table, and passengers get a seat at the table, and get to democratically decide how the industry is going to work best for everybody, instead of a handful of Wall Street vultures who are going to cut to the bone until the industry dies, and then they're going to move on and cannibalize something else. So I guess that's the appeal I'd make is, join RWU, and our campaign to stop the merger. But if that's sort of being on the defensive, right, trying to hold on to what we got now, also join Public Rail Now and join the campaign for public ownership of the railroads, because that's going on the offense. That's fighting for a future, a model for the industry that under which things could actually improve and get better for once. So I guess that's the plug.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Nick, thanks so much for being on the show and for your time. And looking forward to have you back on, I'm sure sometime soon. Keep up the good work, and take care.
Yeah, good luck editing this thing.